Humans are unequivocally causing global heating, and some of the damage is irreversible. That's the sober conclusion of the world's largest ever climate report. The study by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns extreme heat waves, flooding and droughts will become more frequent and intense. But scientists say a catastrophe can be avoided if the world acts fast. Sarah Morice reports.
A code red for humanity. That's how the UN Secretary-General described this landmark report. For many years, the scientific community has said it's likely humans are to blame for our warming planet. But this report goes a step further.
It tells us that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and making extreme weather events more frequent and severe. Second, it shows that climate change is affecting every region on our planet.
The report also concluded the global surface temperature is 1.1 degrees Celsius higher than it was in pre-industrial times. It's likely to hit the so-called tipping point of 1.5 degrees within 20 years. That's about a decade sooner than initially anticipated. Carbon dioxide levels in the air are now at their highest point for at least 2 million years, while Arctic sea ice volume is at its lowest in 100 years.
You know, it's a bit like an alarm clock. You can keep switching the alarm clock off, but eventually, if you don't get out of bed and go to wherever you're meant to be going to, it will be too late. You won't get there in time.
Luckily, scientists say there is still a slim window of opportunity to slow much of the warming. It'll take immediate and deep cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, but even then, some damage is irreversible.
Regardless of how quickly we get our emissions down, we're likely looking at about 15 to 30 centimeters of global average sea level rise through the middle of the century. On average, this would increase the likelihood of what used to be considered a once-in-a-century high water level more than tenfold.
The report is designed to help governments make informed climate change policy, but climate activists fear this one, like many before it, will fall on deaf ears.
We have not once been treating this crisis like an actual crisis. We are not holding people in power accountable, and we are especially not talking about the gap between what politicians are saying and what they are actually doing.
But this report does come at an opportune time. Several extreme weather events are right now sweeping the world with a devastating impact on lives and economies. And in 3 months, the UK will host the 26th UN Climate Change Conference. Some say it will be the world's last chance to pledge meaningful emissions reductions and limit global heating. Sarah Morice, TRT World.
Let's get more on this now with Bob Ward in London. He's the Policy and Communications Director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Good to have you back with us, Bob. This really is a sobering report. The language was much stronger this year than compared with the reports in the prior years. The IPCC says global heating is unequivocally human-made and that the consequences may be irreversible over centuries and even millennia. Do you think these stark messages will actually be heard?
I think it's very difficult now to ignore the evidence. You don't need an IPCC report to look around you at the extreme events that are going on around the world at the moment, and people are joining the dot for themselves. They can see that these things are happening more frequently and with greater intensity, and the only explanation for that is climate change. This report points out that it's going to get worse for at least the next 30 years. Until we get global emissions of greenhouse gases down effectively to zero, it will continue to get worse. And so we're going to have to adapt to those impacts, but also work very hard to bring down those emissions as quickly as we can.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has been equally as urgent in his response, pointing to the burning of fossil fuels as one of the main culprits behind the climate crisis. He joins UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who says that the world needs to consign coal to history in order to address the current situation. Do you agree? And how big of a role are fossil fuels playing in this climate crisis?
The main greenhouse gas that is driving climate change is carbon dioxide. Most of that is released when you burn fossil fuels, coal, oil and natural gas. And so we have to move away from those as sources of energy to cleaner forms of energy. We know how to do it in the electricity sector. You can use renewables, you can use nuclear power. You then can electrify other parts of the economy. Your transport systems can be powered by electricity. We have electric cars. You can power your trains by that. There are some industries where it's going to be very difficult. Cement manufacture itself releases carbon dioxide, so does steel making, but there are alternatives, perhaps using hydrogen, which will allow us to make the transition. And we have to accelerate that action, because the clear message from this is the climate will continue to change until we get greenhouse gas levels around the world down to zero. It's across the world, all countries. There's no room for anybody to say it doesn't apply to me, because as long as we're pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the whole world suffers.
I want to take a look at the corporate response now, the response from the fossil fuel companies themselves. When Royal Dutch Shell published its annual environmental report in April, it boasted that it was investing heavily in renewable energy. On the same day, though, Shell issued a separate statement that revealed its single largest donation to political lobby groups last year was made to the American Petroleum Institute. Now, the API has been actively working to block various aspects of the Biden administration's climate agenda. How culpable are lobby groups like these, as well as the fossil fuel companies who are actually funding them?
Well, the fossil fuel industry has an appalling track record, not because their products have been primarily responsible for driving the rise in carbon dioxide emissions, but because for so long they've been engaged in a misinformation campaign to try and confuse people about the causes of climate change. I think some of the oil companies are now beginning to understand that if they want a future, they have to become true energy companies and not just fossil fuel companies, but they have to move much quicker. My guess is most oil and gas companies are going to go the way of most coal companies, which are going out of business now. They have no future in a world that is dealing with climate change, and they have to invest much more strongly in alternative forms of energy, cleaner forms of energy, such as renewables, and in helping us to electrify our system of transport, particularly getting gasoline-powered cars off the road and replacing them with alternatives powered by electricity or perhaps hydrogen.
And all eyes now will be on the long-awaited climate summit that's due to take place in Glasgow in 3 months' time. Hopefully we'll chat to you again before then. Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute, thank you as always for your analysis.
Thank you.